Welcome to the Mirror Media Podcast with Mukunda Raghavan.
Mirror Media Podcast. You are joined today with myself, Mukunda Raghavan, Krishna Parthasarthi as co-host, and we are very excited today. This has been a long time in the works to have an amazing, not only scholar, economist, polymath, polyglot, just all around man of all seasons, joining us on our podcast today, Dr. Bibek Debroy, who is currently working at the Economic Advisory Council for the Prime Minister's office in India. And he is also known spectacularly for amazing translations of the Vedas, Puranas, Mahabharata, and Ramayana. I think he's working on that also. And he has released one of my favorite books, actually, is one of his older books called Rama and Her Children, which I thought was a fantastic book. So, Dr. Debroy, welcome to the program. So, pranams to you, and thank you so much for joining us. We are truly blessed. How are you today?
Thank you, and thank you for hosting me.
Of course, we're blessed. I mean, the fact that you took the time out to come talk to us is frankly mind-boggling. So you're such a busy man. This is so magnanimous of you. I want to ask, how did you get into? I mean, what's your background? How did you get into translation? How did you get into your desire for economics too? I mean, both those are kind of in your work. You've kind of indicated they're code-related at some level.
Let's ignore the economics for a minute. I never actually wanted to study economics. I wanted to study philosophy, whereupon my father threw a fit. And you might as well study something useful. So economics was his choice. Not that I protested too much. But it was something he had wanted to do. And as happens with many parents, your unmet wishes are dumped on your children. So that's how I got into economics. Now, so far as the translations are concerned, there are different levels at which I can answer. The first level that I can answer is, if you look at the translations I've been doing, there have been some translations that I did in the 1990s, first half of the 1990s. I will explain this in a minute. And there's some translations that I've been doing since 2004-05. So let me take these in two different parts. In the 90s, before I did those translations in the 90s, in the 80s, early 80s, I used to work in Presidency College, Kolkata. And I used to know a professor of economics. He was really a professor of statistics, but he came to be known as a professor of economics, and his name was Ashok Rudra. Was because he's dead now. He was a left-wing Marxist scholar. And he used to teach in Vishwabharati Shantiniketan, which at that time used to be about 4 hours drive or by train from Kolkata. And I occasionally used to go and meet him. And he was contemptuous of my variety of economics and showed it. I was contemptuous of his variety of economics, but dare not show it. My tacit consent, we decided to talk on things other than economics. And he used to write popular stuff on the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. And he had a translation of the Mahabharata. All of these things are in Sanskrit, but the script sometimes differs. And he had a Bengali version, Arya Shastra edition, with the Sanskrit in the Bengali script and a Bengali translation. So once when I had gone to visit him, I casually asked him, the Mahabharata says that the 5 Pandavas became accomplished in the use of 5 different kinds of weapons. Arjuna in all weapons, Bhima in the use of the Gada, Yudhishthir, contrary to impressions about Yudhishthira, in the bow and arrow, and so on and so forth. So what happens if one does a statistical test to see whether there is a significant difference in the frequency with which these people use these weapons? Most people would have said, what a crazy idea, get lost. Ashok Rudra, being a statistician, said, here's my Mahabharata, you take whichever volume you want. The most fierce fighting in the Kurukshetra battle happened when Dronacharya was the general, the Drona Parva. It was fighting at its fiercest. I'm not talking about using Divyastras like Bhishma did and slaughtering 10,000 soldiers a day, not that, but hand-to-hand fight. So I picked out Dronacharya and Drona Parva, and remember this was early 80s. So statistics and computers, they were not what they are. They were not computers. So I sat down, did those tally marks, etc.
Wow.
A paper emerged in Bengali as a result of this. More or less at the same time, by chance, I encountered 2 shlokas. I will translate the shlokas, don't worry. I have had no formal training in Sanskrit, none whatsoever.
Wow.
I didn't study Sanskrit in school. So these 2 chant slokas are, one shloka is from the Valmiki Ramayana, where Rama knows that Sita is in Lanka. But it is the monsoon, so he has to wait before he can actually invade. And Valmiki was superb at describing nature. So there is a verse which goes, Vidyut Pataka Savalaka Mala Shailendra Kota Kriti Sannikasha Garjanti Megha Samudirna Nada Matta Gajendra Iva Sangyugas. Vidyut Pataka, this is the description of the clouds. The clouds have flags of lightning. Savalaka Mala, they are garlanded by flocks of cranes. Vidyut Pataka Savalaka Mala Shailendra Kuta Kriti Sannikasha. The clouds resemble the tops of mountains. Garjanti Megha, the clouds are thundering. And what do the clouds look like? Matta Gajendra Iva Sangyugasa. These are gigantic elephants which are fighting. This is Valmiki. We have not been able to date anything satisfactorily. But several years after Valmiki, there was Kalidasa. Again, a superb poet in terms of describing nature. And Kalidasa has a piece called Meghadutam, translated into English as the Cloud Messenger. There is no substantive story in the Meghadutam. A yaksha has been derelict in the functioning of his duties. He's been cursed by his lord and master Kuvera. Kuvera's capital is Alakapuri, and the yaksha has been banished for 1 year in exile. And while he is there in exile, it is the monsoon, he looks at the clouds, he begins to pine for his beloved who is there in Alakapuri, and he sees a cloud. So he sends the cloud as a messenger. to its beloved in Alakapuri. So the cloud goes, that's the first part, the cloud returns, that's the second part. That's all essentially. Other than that, descriptions of nature. Towards the beginning of Megdutam, says Asarasya Prathama Devase Meghamashlishta Sanum Vapra Krira Parinata Gaja Prekshaniyam Dadarsha. The first day in the month of Asar, Meghamashlishta Sanum, the mountains are covered by clouds. Vapra Krira Parinata Gaja Prekshaniyam Dadarsha. So he saw the clouds, and what are the clouds like? They are like elephants. And what are the elephants doing? Vapra Krira, that is playing. The elephants do when they use their tusks to dig up the ground near river banks. And I thought, oh my God, here are two poets, both describing clouds during the monsoon season. Both compare them to elephants. The Yaksha is pining for his beloved, and what are the elephants doing? The elephants are playing. And Rama is impatient to fight, and what are the elephants doing? The elephants are fighting. And I thought, if I don't read this, I've lost out on something.
Wow.
Wow.
I moved to the Gokhale Institute in Pune. Pune, the Gokhale Institute of Politics and Economics, I moved in as an associate professor there. 83. And right next to that, walking distance, is the Bhandarkar Oriental Research Institute. We talk about the Mahabharata, but the Mahabharata, it had many different versions floating around in India. Differing minor points in this sloka, that sloka, minor differences. Did Veda Vyasa dictate to Ganesha? Did he not dictate to Ganesha? This kind of thing, minor variations. The Bhandarkar Oriental Research Institute sifted through about 1215 different such texts and came up with what is known as the critical edition of the Mahabharata. It took them 50 years from 1916 to 1966. And this is known as the critical edition. The critical edition was a gigantic task. It has its critics on grounds of omission of slokas because they excised some slokas. But it was a fantastic story. The Bhandarkar Oriental Research Institute had a journal called, prestigious journal, it still does, called Annals of the Bhandarkar Oriental Research Institute. So I go there. Once I go there, I had translated, by then I had written several essays in Bengali, including the one I had mentioned. Essays, meaning long essays published in Bengali. I had translated one of them, the one with the tally marks and Drona Parva, weapons of the Kurukshetra war. I translated it into English and went and met the editor, whose name was G.B. Palsule. G.B. Palsule, to his eternal credit, looked me up and down and said, "What do you do?" I said, "I'm an associate professor at the Gokhale of Economics at the Gokhale Institute of Politics and Economics." To his eternal credit, he said, "I shall get the paper refereed." The referee submitted his comments, said nice things about the paper, said, yes, we should publish it. He didn't exactly use the word idiot, but he said, has this idiot not heard of the critical edition of the Mahabharata? If we are going to publish it, it has to be based on the critical edition. So there we go again, tally marks, etc. To cut a long story short, that paper was published. And while I was in Pune, 5 or 6 different papers were published in Annals of the Bhandarkar Oriental Research Institute on all kinds of different things. I moved to Delhi. I hope you're not getting bored.
No,
not at all.
I moved to Delhi. I become a professor at the Indian Institute of Foreign Trade. By then, at that time, Mahabharata was a rage.
The TV show,
Mahabharata was a rage.
Yeah. Mahabharata.
And I thought this is the opportune time. Why don't I publish all of these essays in the form of a book?
Huh.
So in 89, all of these essays, there were 12 of them, they were published in a book by a publisher known as Commonwealth Publishers. It was called Some Essays on the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. Don't try to get it. It's out of print. The publisher has gone bankrupt, not because of this book. The book received rave reviews, but it didn't sell. So that was that. In passing, this book was jointly dedicated to G.B. Palsule and Ashok Rudra. G.B. Palsule had by then become the director of the Bhandarkar Oriental Research Institute. So I went to give these respective venerable gentlemen their copies. G.B. Palsule said, "Thank you very much. No one has dedicated a book to me, but who on earth is Ashok Rudra?" And Ashok Rudra said, "Thank you very much. No one has dedicated a book to me, but who on earth is G.B. Palsule?" It happened. After having read the Ramayana and the Mahabharata in a little bit of detail, I decided to read the Puranas. So I started to read the Puranas and I began to tell those stories to our sons who were growing up. And they seemed to enjoy it. I had a publisher at that time who used to publish my books on economics. His name was Praveen Mittal, DK Publishers, a local Indian publisher. I mentioned it to him. He said, "Why don't you, since you're saying your sons enjoy them, why don't you do the stories of the Puranas in abridged form? And I want each of them to be reduced to about 100 printed pages."
Yeah.
So that's how I ended up doing the 19 Puranas. 19 because I also did the Bhavishya Puran. There's a list of 18. Sometimes
18,
the Bhavishya
yeah.
Puran is not included. I included that also. So the 19, I did that. Then he wanted to do the 11 major Upanishads. Same format, abridged, 100 pages. Did that. Did the 4 Vedas. I said there were 2 phases in this translation. These translations were bad. I'm not proud of them. I did not know Sanskrit sufficiently well. But for whatever reason, they sold like mad. Actually.
Those were your Puranas were one of the ones I got when I used to go to India. I got all your little Puranas.
They still sell.
Yeah.
I go to a book fair held in Delhi where I meet Praveen Mittal. So Praveen Mittal tells me, "Debroy Sahib, your Puranas, you're doing very well. Your Vedas are doing very well. They are on reading lists in various places. I now want you to do an unabridged translation of the Rig Veda. The earlier ones were abridged. I want you to do an unabridged translation of the Rig Veda with the Sanskrit on one side, with the English on the other." I was not interested. To fend him off, I said, "Okay, I shall go back and read the Rig Veda again." When I started to read the Rig Veda, I discovered in the Rig Veda, dogs are used as beasts of burden. When you are reading something with a view to translate in unabridged form, you read every word carefully. I read it earlier also, but it had not registered. So suddenly in the Rig Veda, I find dogs being used as beasts of burden. The Vedas are essentially mantras to different divinities. In the Yajur Veda, I find something, a mantra addressed to a dog. I said, "Oh my God, this had not registered." And soon I was hunting for information on dogs in everything. So we know that Bharat had gone to visit his maternal uncle in Kekai when news was conveyed to him that Dasharath had died. And they didn't tell him that Dasharath had died, they just told him, "Come back to Ayodhya." Kekai was famous for horses, so as gifts, Horses were brought back. Blankets were brought back. Kekai was famous for those also. But in addition, the presents included dogs which had been bred inside the palace.
Wow.
When Sita throws down her earrings as she's being abducted by Jatayu, there's a description of her earrings, and the earrings are in the shape of a dog's tooth. So on and so forth. Ramayana, Mahabharata, Puranas, everything, Jataka stories. I had this manuscript. Sarama is the mother of all dogs, or the dog of the gods.
Indra is Indra's dog, right?
Which is why dogs, everything in Sanskrit has multiple names, but one of the words for dog is Saramaya. That is because they are descendants of Sarama. So I had this manuscript entirely on dogs called Sarama and Her Children, which was refused by 14 publishers. I then went to Penguin.
Fools they were.
Penguin said, we love this manuscript. But wait a minute, we have always wanted to get a translation done of the Bhagavad Gita. Will you do that? So it was not quite a quid pro quo, sounded a little bit like that. So I said, I've always wanted to translate the Bhagavad Gita, and my Sanskrit had improved enormously by then. So that's how I did the Bhagavad Gita translation, and I did the Sarama book. So both were published almost back to back around 2005, 2006. By that time, I was contemplating translating the Mahabharata. Contemplating because it was huge. My translation in 10 volumes runs into 2.25 million words. It was huge, it stretched into infinity, and the track record of people who have attempted translations of the Mahabharata is not very good. 3 of them died in between. So my wife keeps telling me that while you were doing the Mahabharata translation, I was really, really scared. That's how the Mahabharata translation got done. When we meet Krishna in the Mahabharata, he's already an adult. So a question is asked about his childhood exploits. They are there in the Puranas also, but they're also in another text called the Harivangsha, which is regarded as a sequel to the Mahabharata, which is also part of Bhadarkar Oriental Research Institute's critical edition. So after that, I did the Harivangsha. Thereafter, since I've done the Mahabharata, it was but almost inevitable that I should do the Valmiki Ramayana. So I did the Valmiki Ramayana in 3 volumes. After that, I started on something that is even more gigantic. It's the Purana project, which is the translation of the 18 Mahapuranas in unabridged form. The Mahabharata has 100,000 shlokas, believed to have. The critical edition has less. Collectively, the 18 Puranas amount to 400,000 shlokas. So if the Mahabharata was 2.5 million words, the 18 Mahapuranas together will amount to 12 million words.
Good luck.
Out of that, the Bhagavad Puran in 3 volumes and the Markandeya Puran in 1 volume, they've already been published. COVID disrupted matters, but Brahma Puran in 2 volumes and Vishnu Puran in 1 volume are with Penguin. They should be published this year, this calendar year. I have started work on the Shiva Puran now, which is a fairly long Puran. So that's it. Spoken enough for the moment.
Wow. I mean,
I'm not sure if you're working hard enough, Professor.
I mean, obviously, one of the questions is how do you find that time with your full-time job to get to work on these translations?
Okay. Depends a little bit on whether I'm traveling or I'm not traveling. If I'm, obviously, when I have a manuscript to be delivered, there is a deadline. There is a deadline that I and Penguin, all my translations are published by Penguin. There's a deadline Penguin and I have set. If I'm approaching the deadline and I'm traveling, sometimes I carry this stuff on a flight in a hotel, but it's not terribly convenient. Otherwise, if I'm in Delhi and there are no particular meetings, what I've actually eliminated is appearing for TV interviews. Completely eliminated, except the rare occasion appearing for TV interviews. So typically my time for doing this, other than weekends, is something like, let us say, unless there are meetings, is something like about 6:30 to 8. So any dinner invitation after that, 6:30 to 8 typically. So 6:30 to 8, phone is silent. I don't have the mobile with me, that kind of stuff.
Wow. Wow. I mean,
essentially, one way of answering that is essentially about 1,500 words a day.
well, that's doable, right? I mean, but that's quite a. I mean, your Sanskrit has to be pretty good at this point then to be able to go through that 1,500 words a day.
Okay. It's like this, that the way one does the translation is, and some of these texts have not been translated in the past ever. For instance, there are only two people, I'm talking about translations in English.
Right.
There are only two people who have translated the Mahabharata and the Valmiki Ramayana both.
Yeah.
That one is Manmathanath Datta and the other one is I. And some of the Puranas, I'm not talking about the Bhagavad Puran, which is a popular one. Some of the others have not been translated ever into English. And even in some regional languages, non-English languages, you don't really have unabridged translation. But to answer your question, essentially what happens is, this is the way I do the translation. I look at the shloka, I translate it, consulting dictionaries, whatever. And then I look at the preceding translators and what I've done to see if I've missed something. Your translation does not take that much time. But what I'm trying to do in the course of the translation is to make things absolutely clear to the reader.
Professor
Now,
Debroy,
yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but what you said right now is such a beautiful thing, because I'm trying to connect what your process of translation with even the musician's process. This is just coming from my life. We do the same thing with the raga. If I'm gonna sing, Rag Yaman, I'm gonna interpret the raga myself, but then we'll also go consult all the great masters. What did they do with Yaman? What did they say before us? So it's like we're verifying, is our understanding correct? And it's a beautiful process that you're verifying your understanding. You're not just doing it blind. That's beautiful.
So to end what I was saying, quite often a lot of time is spent on chasing a reference. This geographical place, where is it? Can I identify it? This word, what does it actually mean? So a lot of time goes into what are the footnotes. When one looks at a translation, one just thinks, it's a translation. But probably just as much of time actually goes into the footnotes. When it becomes a footnote, it's just a one sentence. But a lot of time is spent on that.
No, absolutely. Even when I was reading through your Sadhama book, there's a lot of footnotes connected to the various different brahmanas or sections of the Vedas, or the translators of, even if you look at Basham versus Griffith and how they view these stories, you bring a lot of that erudition to the table, I think, in your footnotes there. And it plays out in the way you tell the story. So you're actually also one of the three. I mean, out of there's I think 5 people translate the Mahabharata. 3 of them are Bengalis. Is there a reason for that?
No. Unabridged Mahabharata has been translated into English by only 3 people. And yes, all 3 are Bengalis. Lal did a transcreation. It's not really a translation. Chicago, Professor Van Buitenen, because he died, it was left dangling halfway. It has not been completed. The clay edition has also not been completed. So technically, There are just 3 translations. And Pilal, although he was a Punjabi, for many practical purposes, he was a Bengali. So you could stretch the point a bit and say all 4 are Bengalis in some fashion.
Do you think there's a reason why Bengali culture is drawn to translate these texts more so than other cultures within India have not taken the opportunity to do that?
I don't really know the answer to that. Maybe one particular reason is, I'm completely speculating and I may be completely wrong. There was a tradition in 19th century Bengal, during the Bengal, so-called Bengal Renaissance, of people being interested in all kinds of different things. So when these translations have been done or are being done, they're not necessarily being done by Sanskrit Pandits. If I take the 3 Bengali translations or the 4, suppose I include Pilal also.
Yeah.
Kishori Mohan Ganguly was a Sanskrit Pandit. Manmathanath Datta was anything but that. I certainly am not. Pilal was a professor of English literature. So in some sense, because of Bengal's history and legacy, the Brahminical preserve was probably somewhat broken down. So others had access. I don't know if that's some kind of imperfect answer.
I mean, it's a very interesting answer. So, I mean, maybe someone can explore it some other time, but I think it's a good starting point.
You see, the first one who translated it into Bengali in unabridged form in the middle of the 19th century was someone named Kali Prasanna Singha. He was not a Brahmin either.
Yeah. Wow. So when you started your Mahabharata translation, was there did you have a preconception going into it that maybe changed after you did the process?
I know what you're asking, but let me say something else.
Sure.
The first part was the first one, and I'll explain why. Let's not get into arguments about whether they were composed by Veda Vyasa or not, but the belief is they were all composed by Veda Vyasa. And other than the Valmiki Ramayana, everything that I'm translating is Veda Vyasa. So you get familiar with an author's style. And it makes it a little bit easier. So if you see a certain word in a certain sentence placed in a certain way, you automatically, because you're familiar with the author's style, it becomes easier. So that's why the first one was the toughest. And as I've gone along, it's become easier and easier in that particular sense.
What was the first work you translated, Professor Debroy? What was the first one?
The first one was really the serious translation. The first one was the Bhagavad Gita, but the Bhagavad Gita was slightly different in a way. But let me say something before I answer your question. You mentioned music. The point I want to make is that I think all of these texts should now be not only translated, read in the Sanskrit, and be explored by people who come from multiple disciplines. Now, let me give an example of that. In the Markandeya Puran, there is the reference to a demoness. Her name is Jata Harini. Jata Harini, as the name implies, is a demoness who steals a newborn baby, steals an infant. So she steals an infant from house number 1, goes to house number 2 where another baby has been born, takes this baby, puts that baby there, takes that baby away, puts that baby somewhere else and causes confusion. In the process, she devours every third infant. Any Sanskrit Pandit who translates it would just translate it like that. But anyone who has a multidisciplinary sense will say, wait a minute, this is telling me that the infant mortality rate then was 1/3. So 333 by 1000.
Mm.
So let me explore it with that
Context.
socio-economic lens.
Yeah. It's not literal.
Let us take people who are into music and poetry. How many times have we read the Bhagavad Gita? So many times. Sanskrit chanda, Sanskrit meter had a very particular characteristic. It was not about rhyming.
Mhm.
All aksharas, syllables were divided into short and long. And depending on how many syllables there were in a line and the combination of the short and the long, you had different meters. And altogether, there were about 1300 different meters. One of the most common of these was Anushtup.
Anushtup Chandra. Yes.
Anushtup Chanda. And the bulk of Itihas and Purana is in Anushtup Chanda. I'm not going to get into messy details of the combination of short and long, but ignoring that at a even primary level, Anushtup Chanda has 4 lines in a shloka, 8 aksharas per line. Dharma Kshetre Kurukshetre Samaveta Yutsava. 8. Many of the mantras we recite. Vakratunda Mahakaya. 8. Surya Koti Samaprabha. Ya Devi Sarva Bhuteshu. Saraswati Mahabhage. And I think the musical tradition has only been preserved of this kind, has only been preserved in the South.
Interesting.
But this is a tradition of the music and the poetry and the chanda that can be used to disseminate Itihas Purana, to teach Itihas Purana, to explore Itihas Purana.
Can you say more about that? Can you say more about that? Why the distinction between South and North? Why is it only preserved in the South? Can you say more about that?
I have no idea. I don't know. Meaning, why is it?
But what observations have you made to come to those conclusions?
Take something like Aigiri Nandini Nandita Medini. Where do I get a beautiful singing on this? Coming from the south. Tandav Stotram. Where do I get a beautiful rendering of this?
You know, Dr. Debroy, it's so refreshing to hear you because most North Indian people I meet, they hate Carnatic music. And so I'm hearing someone from Bengali, Delhi, proper Indian person who appreciates Carnatic music. It makes me so happy. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Shuddha Brahma Parat Pararam. This is not Anushtup. This is 9 actually. But the point is, it's popularized by a Carnatic singer.
Yes. So I don't know the answer because I'm not a historian. But coming back to your question, the question that you asked is obviously changes you.
Yeah.
How it changes you, I'm probably not the right person to ask because you are the object. The person who perceives how you have changed is someone outside. But it's palpably obvious that it changes you.
No, I guess my question was more to the fact that, so when you started doing the translations and really getting deep dive into the subject matter and the text, you probably came in with something preconceived notion about what was in the text or what the text was saying or what it meant. Did you afterwards come out with a different opinion about what you thought previously?
You see, to a certain extent, I was already familiar with the texts. To a certain extent, because remember, I said I had done the abridged translations earlier. But so far as preconceived notions are concerned, the preconceived notion, particularly about the Puranas, is that these are about stories.
Huh.
They're not. The stories would account for perhaps 1/3. They cover everything under the sun. They cover what we would call governance, Rajadharma. They cover a householder's duties. They cover geography. The Matsya Purana talks about how temples should be constructed. The Agni Purana describes the form of the image of a god or goddess. The Shraddha ceremonies are described in the Garud Purana. So they describe our day-to-day life. They're encyclopedias. So I guess I would say that I was not fully appreciative of the extent to which they were encyclopedias.
Right.
Because when I had done the abridged translations, I also picked on the stories, because the stories are the more interesting from a certain lens. Using a certain lens is the stories which are the more interesting.
Yeah,
Right.
Entertainment.
Yes.
So why do you think in the Indian, I mean, this is India's heritage. This is India's lifeblood, since the dawn of time. Why is there a lack of, in some sense, within, because I've lived in India for various years throughout my life, both professional and college time. There seems to be a lack of basic knowledge of these texts or the traditions outside of watching Mahabharata, and Doordarshan. I find there's a lack of this corner in India. Why do you think that is?
Okay, let me draw a distinction between the Ramayana and the Mahabharata and the Purana. The Ramayana and the Mahabharata, there is some degree of familiarity. However imperfect, there is some degree of familiarity about the Ramayana and the Mahabharata.
Yeah.
Of course, they're based on very superficial telling. So everything is portrayed in black and white. There are the heroes and the villains. It's like the standard Bollywood.
Yeah, Lord of the Rings, the orcs versus the harvest.
Mahabharata and the Ramayana, they're much more complicated than that. I will tell you a story and linking it with dogs in a minute from the Ramayana.
You can talk about dogs all you want. We'll be happy to hear. We're dog lovers.
Okay, so I'll tell you the story about dogs in a minute. So far as the Puranas are concerned, I think the issue is Hinduism has several texts. But Hinduism or understanding of Hinduism has been equated with moksha dharma.
Yeah.
The dharma of emancipation. So whenever one is talking about texts on Hinduism, it will be Vedanta, it will be Upanishads, and by extrapolation, it will also be the Bhagavad Gita. But these texts were composed by who? These texts were composed by people who are in Vanaprastha and Sannyas. Bulk of the population then, as is the case now, they were not interested in sannyas. They were householders, they were grihasthas, they were in the ashram of garhastha. They did what we did today. They earned wealth, hopefully by legitimate means. And they were interested in dharma, artha and kama. So where are these descriptions? These descriptions are not in the Upanishads and the Aranyaks and the Brahmanas. These descriptions are in Itihas and Purana.
For the masses. For the masses. Everybody.
For the mass. But because of the equation of Hinduism with otherworldliness and moksha, I think these have not been translated. For example, if you look at the translations that were edited and commissioned by Max Muller in the 19th century, Sacred Books of the East, you will find the Upanishads, you will find the Dharma Shastras. Will you find Itihas Purana? No. That is the reason. Now, of the story about the dog, let me tell you the story about the dog. This is from the Uttarkanda of the Valmiki Ramayana, which is regarded as a subsequent interpolation, although I think actually it was much more complicated than that.
Yeah.
And this story is not part of the critical edition also. Rama had defeated Ravana. Rama was back in Ayodhya. All was well with the world. There was Rama Rajya. No complaints, no drought, no famine. People did not die before their time, no unexpected disease, no COVID, nothing. However, Lakshmana was given a task. Every morning you shall go at 9 o'clock in the morning. It didn't say 9, it said morning. You shall go outside the palace to the courtyard where there is a bell, where anyone who has a complaint can come and ring the bell, and the complainant will be brought before the king. There was a dog which was sleeping on the road. A Brahmana was passing, and the dog was obstructing the Brahmana's path. So the Brahmana took his stick and beat the dog on the head. And when beaten on the head, the dog moved away. So the dog came to complain to Rama. Lakshmana came out, he found the dog was there. The dog said, I have a complaint, you have to take me to the king. Lakshmana said, no, look, dogs cannot go before the king. Dog said, who says? Rama says everyone with a complaint can go before the king. I have a complaint, take me before the king. So the dog is taken before the king. Rama says, what's your problem? The dog says, look, I was sleeping. All the Brahmana, I acknowledge that I was obstructing the Brahmana's path. All the Brahmana had to do was to ask me to move away, and I would have moved away. Instead, without asking me to move away, he beat me on the head, and that's a crime. So the Brahmana is summoned. Brahmana is asked. Brahmana says, yes, it is true. Yes, it is true, I should have asked him to move. Yes, it is true that I did not. I beat him on the head. So that's since I'm guilty. So Rama looks at all the ministers and the advisors and says, tell me, what should I do? All of them say, you cannot punish a Brahmana. How can you punish a Brahmana? No king can punish a Brahmana. And the dog says, no, he's guilty. You must punish him, otherwise you are not a king. So Rama looks at the dog and says, dog, you tell me, what should I do? There is a fort, it still exists, called Kalinjar, border of MP and UP. Technically it's in UP, but it's border. The dog says, make him the Kuladhipati, the lord of Kalinjar.
Kalinjar.
Rama says, okay, make the Brahmana the lord of Kalinjar. So the Brahmana has put an elephant, given servants, maids, given a lot of jewels, wealth, servants, soldiers, and he goes off to Kalinjar. And all the ministers and the advisor look at the king and say, what is this? You're supposed to punish him, but you rewarded him. He's become the lord of Kalinjar. So Rama looks at the dog and says, this dog is wiser than all of you. Dog, will you please tell them the story? The dog says, in my last life, I was the lord of Kalinjar. If you are the lord of Kalinjar, there is a lot of scope for bribery and rent seeking. Because I indulged in bribery and rent seeking in this life, I have been born as a dog. So the Brahmana ostensibly may have been rewarded, but he's actually been punished. But to come to what I was saying, for example, take the Bhagavad Gita. Bhagavad Gita, it says Bhagavat Gita. Bhagavat is an adjective.
Yeah.
Gita is anything that is recited or sung. When I say what I'm about to say, many people are astounded. That altogether there are around 60 different Gitas. Bhagavad Gita is only one.
Anugita,
In the
Devi Gita.
Mahabharata itself, there are 20 Gitas, depending on how you define and count a Gita. I have done a translation of, it's called Mahabharata Gitas. It is the non-Bhagavad Gita, Gitas, Mahabharata. That will be published early in 2022. But anyway, to come back to this point.
Wait, Professor Debroy, sorry to interrupt you, but my understanding of that was the Britishers, when they came to India, they were looking for some central text like the Bible, so they settled on the Bhagavad Gita as like the Hindu Bible. Like this is what they decided, and is something like that. And is that correct?
I agree. You see, the Bhagavad Gita was one of the first texts to be translated with a forward of all things by forward or preface, whichever it was, by Warren Hastings. But there is no particular reason why today we should not be familiar with the fact that there are other Gitas also in the Mahabharata, that all of the Gitas are not about moksha dharma. One of the most famous Gitas in the Mahabharata is the Dharma Vyasa Gita. The Dharma Vyasa Gita is about the duties of a householder, a grihastha.
Grihastha.
There was a sage named Kaushik who was meditating in the forest. He was intent on his meditation and he acquired powers as a result of his meditation and austerities. There was a bird, a crane, on top of the tree. And while he was seated there in his posture of meditation, the bird shat on his head. So Kaushik glared angrily at the bird, and because of the powers he had acquired through austerities, the bird was reduced to ashes, fell down and died. After this, Kaushik went around begging for alms in the village. And this is a village that he occasionally went to beg alms in. He went to a house that he was familiar with. The lady of the household says, wait, I'll just get something for you. Let me wash the vessels, I'll get something for you. At that time, the lady's husband returns home. So she keeps Kaushik waiting, begins to tend to her husband. Wash his feet, feed him, etc., etc. And Kaushik, who is waiting there, is getting very, very angry. When the lady comes out, Kaushik looks angrily at her. The lady says, I had to do my duty first. That was my dharma. My dharma is to tend to my husband when he comes back. Why are you glaring at me like that? Do you think that I am a crane that you will glare at me and I will be reduced to ashes? Kaushik says, wait a minute, how did you know this? The lady said, because I've been doing my dharma, I've also acquired power. So Kaushik says, please become my guru. The lady says, I am not competent to be a guru. If you're looking for a guru, go to this hunter in Mithila. He will be a guru. So Kaushik goes there and meets this Vyad, the hunter, the butcher, who instructs me about dharma for householders. So there was a lot in the Mahabharata, including in the nature of the Gitas, which are for householders. You're absolutely right that the Bhagavad Gita has become the most important text for those who are in pursuit, particularly of moksha dharma. Bhagavad Gita has more than that. Or Ashtavakra Gita for that matter.
Yeah.
There are these texts also.
So, I love that, Dr. Debroy, because, I mean, not only is the story important, but the characters, the identity of the characters, right? A woman telling this Brahmana that she knows Dharma, that how she was able to perform her Dharma with compassion better than the Brahmana Kaushik was. And then she sends him to another non-Brahmin who is, a hunter who can instruct him on Dharma. It's this flipping, the inversion of what we currently think about in terms of caste politics or the Varna system. It's this inversion. And the Mahabharata is utterly filled with them. With even a conversation of Sudlabha and Janaka is brilliant in that.
Hey, let me add on to that. It's not just the inversion. It's there's something for everyone. It's just not people looking for one thing in life. Like you said, dharma, artha, kama, moksha. There's something for everyone. And for some reason, people have associated these spiritual texts with just moksha. This is just for people who want to run away and become sannyasis. And that's the biggest problem I realized with our the PR, the public relations of our Hinduism. People associate it with just someone going Om Ram Om Namah Shivaya Om Namah Shivaya. The whole time they're just doing this. No, Krishna is Loka Samgraha. It's be in the world. Go do it. Go out there. It's yeah. Anyway, that's my
To
speech.
add to that, to add to what you just said, let me quote a shloka. The reason I'm quoting a shloka is that it is a fairly well-known shloka. People quote it quite a bit. And if not in Sanskrit, at least in the English. And then this shloka from the Mahabharata is Kashtancha Samayetang Mahadadhau Sametta cha Vepayetang Tatbat Bhuta Samagama. Just as on the ocean, two pieces of wood come together, stay together for a while, having stayed together for a while, drift apart. Relationships among beings are just like that, meaning that nothing is permanent, no relationship is permanent. This is quoted quite a bit. Yes, it is from the Mahabharata. Where in the Mahabharata? This is one of the multiple Gitas in the Mahabharata. And this particular Gita is known as Pingala Gita. So this shloka is from Pingala Gita. And who is Pingala? Who was Pingala? Pingala was a courtesan. She was a prostitute. So you're talking about learnings from a woman, which is correct. But here is a Gita, which is about learnings from a prostitute.
It's brilliant. It's brilliant.
Yeah, knowledge comes from everywhere. Yeah.
So to follow up on this, you're in government. You spend a lot of time in government. How does like Shanti Parva, Anushasana Parva, much of the Mahabharata itself is about how to govern properly and think about governance. Do you think within the Indian context, people in political science or politics understand what this text has to teach about politics?
All right. If you ask people, name a text on political economy, name a text on governance, most people will say Arthashastra, Kautilya's Arthashastra. Kautilya's Arthashastra was a manuscript that had been lost. Mm-hmm. It had been lost until Professor Shama Shastri rediscovered it in 1905 and translated it. There is a national mission for manuscripts called Namami. Namami estimates that there are 40 million manuscripts in India, estimates. Public collections, private collections, a manuscript being defined as something that is more than 75 years old. Out of these, 95% have still not been translated. They're not all in Sanskrit, some are in Pali also, but they've still not been translated. Until they are translated, what about the knowledge in them? I have a copy of a 13th century text, which I don't think has been translated. It is called Chaudhya Shastra. As the name implies, it is a manual for thieves. If translated, it would amount to, it would become a book of about 350 printed pages.
Can you send me the Amazon link on that one?
When it is published, meaning this is it's not a published book yet.
Chaudhya Shastra. Okay.
Chaudhya Shastra. Now, in the Mahabharata, there is a substantive section called Raja Dharma. Rajan at that time is the counterpart of the government today, the king. Rajan, there are many words for king. Rajan is a word, Nripa is another word for a king. But every king is not a Rajan. According to the Itihas Purana, the first king who was a Rajan was Prithu, because his father Vena was extremely wicked. Prithu set out the template for what a king should do. And he was the first Rajan, because the root word for Rajan is someone who delights. So a king becomes Rajan only when he causes delight to the subjects. So if I look at all of these texts and I see what the king was supposed to do, what the Rajan was supposed to do, and I'm talking about domestic, because there's plenty of stuff in Kautilya and outside in when Bhishma is lying down on his bed of arrows in Shanti Parva and Anushashan Parva and other texts, also in the Dharma Shastra texts like Manusmriti. There are plenty of things on what the government or the king should do vis-a-vis external powers, other kingdoms. But so far as the domestic part of it is concerned, punish the wicked, protect the virtuous, have an efficient dispute resolution system, protect property rights. This is all that a king was supposed to do. A lot of the stuff was left to others. In terms of the template for dharma, there were things that a king was supposed to do, Raja Dharma. There were things that the community did. Skill formation was not done by the government. It was done by the Shrenis or the guilds. Unfair trade practices, restrictive business practices were not looked after by the government. They were looked after by Shrenis. Something like MRP, maximum retail price, was determined by the Shrenis. And there was the individual. The individual had to do 5 Mahayagnas every day, the Grihastha, which also involved doing civic works. We use the word Ishta and Purti. What is Ishta and what is Purti? Ishta is a sacrifice. Purti is civic works. It is building a road. It is building even a temple. Now, this was done because it was your dharma to do that. It was not because there was the rod of corporate social responsibility which said you had to do that. In other words, the king or the government had a limited role, and the rest of it was to be done by the community and citizens. That was the template for governance. In that day and age, the tax ratio, so to speak, was 16%. Today, India's tax GDP ratio is around 15%, a little bit less than that. But look at the number of things that we expect the government to do today.
Yeah.
With virtually the same or lower taxes, and look at the things that citizens and communities did that then and have abdicated. So when you did not ask the question like that, but when I look at it, that template involves not just what the government should do, it also involves what others should be doing. In other words, there is a need for prioritization about what government should be doing, and the primary responsibility of government anywhere in the world, the primary responsibility is to ensure security, internal and external, dispute resolution, protection of property rights. So yes, in terms of understanding of Raja Dharma, understanding of Dharma gleaned from these texts, it is this.
So India is, for us, the seat of all these texts. It is the place where they're birthed, that they grew and lived. And I know there's a historical reason for, all these changes and the way the government's structured. But how does one teach Dharma from, these texts in the modern world, and how can it apply in this modern world with different liberal, like Western liberal paradigms there, other Marxist paradigms also there? How does one negotiate that?
Well, I think the first step, which is how I would interpret, at the risk of being somewhat egoistic, I would interpret my text as my translation, my work as an attempt to do this exercise of dissemination. So the first step is to know that this is what used to happen. You said modern world. The British documented everything, and they authored these wonderful, wonderful things called district gazetteers. Ambala District Gazetteer from the year 1883. What's happening in Ambala in the year 1883? In the year 1883 in Ambala, a canal has to be built for purposes of irrigation. In 1883 rupees, this was going to cost about 45,000 rupees. I've rounded it off a little bit, roughly 45,000 rupees. Government of the day paid 20,000. Who paid the remainder? 25,000 the community did. So this modern world, this is not thousands of years ago, this is just 1883. What seems to have happened for various historical reasons, beginning with the British, there was too much of centralization. Traditional methods of dispute resolution got supplanted by the British court system. Similarly, for village constables, etc., I can go on and on. So for their own reasons, the British excessively centralized. And post 47, with the emphasis on planning, etc., as citizens, we became pampered. We abdicated our responsibility. And we expect government to do everything. You mentioned these two extremes. These two extremes, it's a bit of a caricature because that ideal does not exist anywhere in the world. But the capitalist system is one where everything is left to the market.
Laissez-faire.
The socialist one is where everything is left to the state.
Yeah.
But we had a template that was in between, where some things were done by the state, some things were done by citizens, the market, but a whole lot of things were done by the community. Now, that is a template that one might even say is an alternative template to the two existing polar extremes of socialism and capitalism. But it needs to be disseminated because we are losing appreciation for the fact that this legacy existed.
Yeah, that's right. And it is telling that when these texts were written, or if we say they're written around the time before the British, India's percentage of global GDP was like almost a third, right? They were incredibly wealthy and doing well in those time periods before, when they kept those older kinds of mentalities. Yeah. It's so. What would you tell people that listen to this podcast in India that are interested in understanding Dharma? What would you say are the fundamentals of Dharma for them to understand, and so they can build off of?
I would be very reluctant to use the word dharma. The reason I would be very reluctant to use the word dharma is that the word dharma can only be imperfectly translated into English because it has multiple meanings in multiple contexts.
Yeah.
There is moksha dharma. There is the daily dharma, the nitya dharma that I do, whether it is the pancha mahayaggas that a household is supposed to do.
Yeah.
There is the raja dharma. there is the Varnashram Dharma, and there is the Dharma that I individually follow.
Samanya
And,
Dharma.
and one of the things, one of the lessons from these texts is that in that individual Dharma sense, morality is not absolute. Let me give an example to illustrate what I'm trying to say. You mentioned towards the beginning about Arjuna. Well, we all know about Bhishma. So he was on a vow of brahmacharya. And to cut the long story short, the princess of Kashi, Amba, said, if you do not marry me, I will immolate myself in the fire. And Bhishma said, but I have got this vow of brahmacharya. And Amba immolates herself, becomes Shikhandi. We know that story. What is sometimes not known is that Arjuna was on a temporary vow of brahmacharya for 1 year. At which point Ulupi, the Naga princess, fell in love with him and said that if you do not marry me, I will kill myself. You decide which dharma is important for you. Your dharma of directing brahmacharya or your dharma of saving the life of a woman. So two Kshatriyas, both in situations of brahmacharya. Bhishma stuck to brahmacharya. Arjuna decided to marry Ulupi.
Is that
So,
is that Babruvahana's mother?
No, that's Iravan. Iravan.
Iravan.
Iravan.
Oh. Who is his son? Who is his child from Ulupi?
Iravan. Iravan.
Iravan. He just said
Iravan. Oh,
Iravan.
sorry. I'm sorry. Sorry. Got it.
Okay. So the lessons of our text is you do not have absolute norms of morality. No one will say, thou shalt not steal. There are no commandments like that. But what you need to accept is every decision I take, according to my perception of Dharma, will lead to consequences. So karma is the flip side of Dharma. The two are linked together. Now, so far as anyone who wants to understand Dharma is concerned, I would say this is a complex subject. Repeatedly, our texts say the notion of Dharma is very subtle.
Sukshma.
Yes. So, therefore, do not read simplified tellings of the text. If you are interested, read the unabridged versions so that all the nuances come across to you. Preferably read them in the Sanskrit. If you cannot read them in the Sanskrit and you're going to read them in the English, obviously I would recommend mine, but there are others also.
Can I ask? I think this is an interesting question. So, Professor Debroy, we've been focusing so much on the Itihasas and the Puranas and the Vedas of our culture. Have you been inspired or found any resonant texts in other cultures of the world? And if so, can you tell us a little bit about that? And if you see any parallels with our Sanatana Dharma tradition?
No, that I should not really answer because I obviously partly because of the kind of school I went to, I am reasonably familiar with the Bible. I am reasonably familiar because of my interests with the Buddhist texts. But I am not an expert in these by any stretch of the imagination. So, therefore, it would not really be fair for me even to hazard an answer to that question.
Fair enough.
No, I appreciate that. So I know we've taken up so much of your time. Krishna, do you have any last questions that you think that you want to ask?
I was. There's a noise coming. You hear that?
Yeah.
No, these are the Republic Day rehearsals.
Oh, I
Oh,
see.
yes. Okay.
These are the planes flying past.
Okay. Well, yeah. Well, I guess. Do you have any other interests aside from being an economic advisor and translations? Do you have any other hobbies in life that keep you happy and going?
Hobbies. Look, at one point, till a certain age in life, I used to play chess quite seriously, but not anymore. The other thing, I'm not very sure whether should be called a hobby or not. There is this style of a 5-line rhyme that was popularized by Edward Lear called a limerick. So 5 days a week for a newspaper known as Mint, I write a limerick every day.
Oh,
Wow. Can you share one with us right now?
Right now, I have to dig up whatever I've written.
Okay, we'll look it up. Okay, we'll look it up then. No problem.
So, just the last question, Professor. Is there any last, thoughts that you would like to share to our readers or our listeners and viewers about the importance of these texts, or about anything particular that you think that they should know?
No. Let me put it like this: that I'm reasonably aware than most people, but every day as I translate, I learn something new. And there are several things that we automatically do. We don't always know why we do them. And the explanations are in these texts, particularly the Puranas. The Valmiki Ramayana is, from this perspective, the Valmiki Ramayana is not that rich because it's a simple story from Rama's point of view. It has interesting aspects, but not from the perspective that I was talking about. The Mahabharata, most people are aware, so they know the basic details. The Puranas have been a discovery for me every day. For example, I'm translating the Shiva Purana now. I said I'm reasonably aware. I did not know until I translated the Shiva Purana that Rudrakshas have different faces, right? Ekmukhi, Panchamukhi, etc., etc. I did not know that there is a specific mantra depending on the Mukhi of the Rudrakshas. Some people who are more aware than me may know about this, but they probably do not know that the rationale and the explanation for this comes from the Shiva Purana. So like that, every day I'm learning something new, and I would recommend the reading of the Puranas.
Yeah, I mean, right now I'm doing Vishnu Purana. So that is very unique because it's Parasharas versus Vyasas. And I find it to be fascinating with its connection with the Vishnu and Lakshmi being inseparable in many ways. Have you done the Vishnu Purana yet, sir?
Yes, but it's waiting with the publisher. It will be published towards the end of this year.
Hey, can I say one more thing just to inspire you, Dr. Debroy? You're doing such good work that's affecting people all around the world. And I have a 5-year-old daughter named Lalita, and sometimes she's very fussy to put to bed, and we can't put her to bed. We'll try to reason with her and everything. But if my wife, Maya, says, Lalita, can I tell you a story? Immediately she shuts up, she gets into her bed, and she'll listen to the story. And so what you're doing is you're spreading stories, and so we're so thankful that, like you said, the Puranas will tell you why you did what you did. What a beautiful idea. And
you will have to give me 3 more years, I think, or 2 more years, because then I will do the Brahmanda Purana. And you may not know that the Lalita Sahasranama comes from the Brahmanda Purana. And I'm stressing the Lalita Sahasranama because it is sung throughout the South.
I want an autograph copy from you.
Well, thank you so much, Professor.
Namaste.
Thank you for your time. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
For everything. Thank you.
Yeah, we appreciate it.
Pushpa sugandha sumalaya samire pavana munijana yamuna tire pavana munijana yamuna tire gayati vanamali. वनमाली